All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the final session of Intelligent Speech 2020. Before our closing remarks, it is my honor and privilege to introduce you Nia Clarke. And our topic is this: Black Wall Street, 1921, chronicles history and events before, during, and after the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. By illuminating the social and ethnic makeup of Oklahoma prior to statehood, and by highlighting the culture of the United States as it related to race relations before 1921, Black Wall Street 1921 lays out the historical foundation of the Tulsa Race Massacre so that listeners can have a clear idea of the complicated and painful dynamics that existed in Oklahoma and throughout the United States, which made it possible for such an event as the massacre to occur. Finally, by illustrating the actual massacre as well as the hardship victims that the victims of the massacre endured in an auditory format, giving the attack and the resolve that enabled them to build the prosperous Black Wall Street following the attack, listeners are given a vivid example of the perils of hate and prejudice. Hopefully, listeners will also be inspired by those who persisted in spite of that hate. Nia, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us at Intelligent Speech.
And thank you so much for having me, Eric. And thank you so much for being my right-hand man during this session. I'm so excited to be with everybody today. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in and joining us. So this is a passion project of mine, my podcast, Black Wall Street 1921. I don't know how many of you had a chance to listen to it, but if you haven't, it's okay, because we're going to talk about it today. And obviously, it chronicles the Tulsa Race Massacre. But to understand what happened in the Tulsa Race Massacre, we need to take it back to the 19th century, really prior to statehood, because there were so many things happening both in Oklahoma and in the country in general that really led up to the Tulsa Race Massacre. So Eric, if you could just bring up my slide for me, that'd be great. And we'll get started. All righty, so here we are. Eric, so the problem is with my slide, I need to be able to go back and forth, and I think I can't do that if I don't have the ability to share my screen there. So is there a way to remedy that, Eric? Okay, let's see here. See if it just works for me. All right. Now I'm going to go to the first slide, which is the introduction. All right, good. It's working. Never mind. We're good to go, everybody. All right. So introduction. Between May 31st and June 1st of 1921, what the Oklahoma Historical Society calls, quote, the single worst incident of racial violence in American history, claimed the lives of hundreds of people and left an entire community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, completely decimated. The community is known as Greenwood. It was an African-American district in North Tulsa, and it suffered a brutal attack by a white mob, which resulted in a horrific scene of chaos, destruction, and bloodshed. The area had a population of about 10,000 people at the time, and it was considered one of the most, or if not the most, affluent African-American community in the United States for the early part of the 20th century. And that is how it got its name, Black Wall Street. All right. Initially, the bloody attack became known as the Tulsa Race Riot in the years following. Today, the city of Tulsa and a lot of other people, we prefer the name Tulsa Race Massacre. It more accurately describes what happened. All right. But again, in order to really understand what was happening, we need to understand how the Tulsa Race Massacre came to be. And just to give you a background, this was a tumultuous time in American history. And let's do a little history lesson. So we all know about what was called the Trail of Tears when we were in school. I think most of us were taught about the Trail of Tears. Sorry, here's just a little rundown of some of the things we're going to talk about today. So while a number of Native American tribes already inhabited what is present-day Oklahoma, many other natives arrived via the infamous Trail of Tears during the forced removal of tribes from the southeastern part of the United States, eventually settling in what was known then as Indian Territory in the 1800s, part of that being present-day Oklahoma. What is rarely mentioned, however, in history classes and books is that several of these tribes, 5 to be exact, possessed African American slaves, Black slaves, who also traveled along the brutal and often deadly Trail of Tears with their Native American slave masters, and also settled in Indian Territory with their Native American slave masters. These tribes, they were called the 5 civilized tribes at the time, and they were the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee Creek, and the Seminole. And they were called the 5 civilized tribes because they adopted European customs, including chattel slavery. Now, what ended up happening is that many Black inhabitants of early Oklahoma, then Indian Territory, and let me just switch the slide so you can see. So this is a map of Indian Territory right now. What we're looking at, this is what it looked like back then. So many Black inhabitants of this territory, they formed a number of all Black communities following slavery, due in large part to treaties between the U.S. government and Native Americans, which forced the natives to free their slaves and allot them individual plots of land. So what do I mean by this? Well, by then, many of the African Americans had either perhaps commingled or married a lot of the Native Americans, and many of the Black people in Indian Territory possessed Native ancestry. And so what ended up happening is that each member received an equal share in the tribal estate in the form of 80 acres, an allotment. And each person had to prove that they had Native ancestry in their blood, which was not hard to do at the time. So essentially, the U.S. government gave free land to Black people. Before Oklahoma was even a state, they gave free land really to anybody who was part of these tribes or who possessed ancestry as part of these tribes. And that is how a lot of African Americans, that is how actually the first African Americans came to live in what we know as Oklahoma. And that is how many African Americans began to build their wealth, because back then getting free land was really like getting gold, actually. And so that is really important to know. And at the time, or rather between the late 19th century, early 20th century, Oklahoma had the largest number of all Black towns or cities in the United States at that point. Here's another map of Indian Territory, a very old one there. If you look closely, you can actually see where these tribes live. So you have the Seminole in the middle there. You've got the Creek in the middle there. You've got the Cherokee kind of at the top left. The Osage above the Cherokee, just to give you an idea. Now, incidentally, many of the Native American slave masters, they were against freeing their slaves. It wasn't good for them. And they were against giving African Americans individual allotments of land, because this was sovereign Indian or Native American land, but the U.S. government essentially took it away from them because they wanted to develop Oklahoma, and they needed people to do that. And so this is just one of the leaders of one of the tribes who was not in favor of these policies. And so we're going to continue on. So next, Oklahoma, a promised land. Without the discovery of oil in the Tulsa area and throughout Oklahoma, it is very likely that what we know today as Black Wall Street or the Greenwood district of North Tulsa would have never existed. Many African Americans benefited greatly from the business and development that the discovery of oil in the region generated for Tulsa. However, Black people in general were not allowed to take part in the oil business directly because of racism and discrimination, but they did benefit indirectly from the business that it spurred. So we know that Oklahoma was unique during the early 20th century because a large amount of oil was being drilled there, a very large amount, actually. Now, Oklahoma was drilling between 1900 and 1935. It ranked first in oil production among the mid-continent states there. And so Tulsa also had a large amount of oil being drilled and found around it. And it was, just a huge economic boom that occurred during that time. So we do know that at this time, the U.S. government wanted this land to be developed because there were still large parts of Oklahoma that were not. And so the government opened up land for settlement for large numbers of migrants through what we know today as land runs. Okay. And I'm just going to switch the slide here. If you've gotten a chance to read that, that's great. So here's a oil well here in Oklahoma in 1922. You can see there. So the legal basis for opening up what is known as the Oklahoma District at the time, but now known as the unassigned lands, came in 1889 when the Indian Appropriations Bill was amended, authorizing President Benjamin Harrison to declare 2 million acres in that region open for settlement. And so under the Homestead Act of 1862, a legal settler could claim 160 acres of public land. And those who lived on and improved the land for 5 years could receive a title, essentially. So again, we see this theme of people being able to come in. I mean, literally, they would open up the access to this land at certain times of the day, and folks would come in from, all over, really staking their claim. And this may not have been potentially problematic if these events were not happening just a few decades after the end of slavery and the forced removal of Native Americans from the southeastern United States, in a country that had been torn apart during the Civil War, in part because of slavery. And it had a complicated history when it comes to race. And it's important to note that, we had folks from the South, Black folks from the South escaping Jim Crow. We had, Europeans coming over. We had white people coming, really anybody and everybody who wanted a chance to sort of chart their own course and build their own sort of legacy was coming to Oklahoma. All right, so let's move on. So this is just an example of a classroom in Muskogee, Oklahoma, of Black children. Education was very important back then. Just an example of the type of opportunities that Black families were looking for in Oklahoma. Another photo of a school, Dunbar School in 1917, Muskogee, Oklahoma. All right. So we're going to move on here again. Black Wall Street is born. So I really love this part of the story because one of the things that's interesting about this is the cultural influence that jazz had on Oklahoma. It was really one of the most culturally influential elements taking shape in places across Oklahoma, especially in those all Black towns we mentioned. And according to the Oklahoma Historical Society, to understand the history of jazz in Oklahoma, one must first consider the settlement patterns of the state because they reflect its cultural diversity. All right. And so we also know, according to the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame, the evolution of jazz music could be traced through the migration of Blacks westward from New Orleans through Texas and Oklahoma to Kansas City. From 1890 to 1910, Blacks immigrated to Oklahoma, and it became a center of ragtime musicians and really contributed to those all Black towns and including the Greenwood district as well in Oklahoma, what we know today as Black Wall Street. But what was life like for African Americans living in Oklahoma and particularly in Black Wall Street at the time? Well, during the first couple of decades of the 20th century, it really depended on kind of your socioeconomic status. Again, we had a lot of people, Black people escaping the Jim Crow South, seeking new opportunity. And according to the Tulsa Historical Society, from the mid-19th century to 1920, African Americans, they established more than 50 identifiable towns and communities, and many started cohesive farming communities that supported businesses, schools, and churches, eventually gaining town status. Entrepreneurs in these communities started every kind of imaginable business, including newspapers, grocery stores, and they advertised throughout the South that this was something of a promised land for people who were looking to start anew, for settlers. Now, there were definitely exceptional success stories here. And one of the most, let me move my screen here so you can see. Okay, so this is a picture of some of the leaders early on in Black Wall Street, or the Greenwood district. And if you look at the bottom row, second from the left, you'll see O.W. Gurley. He is known as one of the first Black millionaires in the United States. And he was very influential with regards to helping Tulsa and particularly Greenwood develop into this flourishing community. And you've got some other influential men there in that picture as well. And so we do know that one of the most prominent people who was killed in the Tulsa Race Massacre, I'm going to skip ahead here. this is Dr. A.C. Jackson. According to the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, he's described as a physician who transcended the color line and treated both white and black patients, which was very unusual for that time. However, he was not the only black physician in Greenwood at the time. There were more than a dozen black physicians there. There were also lawyers, realtors, and other professionals. However, most people in Greenwood at the time, they were working class people. A lot of people were domestics. A lot of people were servants. A lot of people worked in the hospitality industry. And uniquely, they were not really allowed to spend their money freely in greater Tulsa or downtown Tulsa, for all intents and purposes, the white section of Tulsa, because of segregation and racism. So they decided that they were going to create a community that made it so that they never had to travel outside of that community for anything they needed. And that is how Black Wall Street was born. It was born as this insular community out of necessity because of the racism and the segregation that existed at the time. This is just a picture of a house. It gives you an idea of how, how beautiful and how fortunate some of these homes were and some of these families were. This would be a beautiful home, for today in 2020, let alone back then for a Black family in the early part of the 20th century. This is a family of John and Lola Williams, a very prominent family. In the backseat is their son, W.D. Williams. They owned garages, rental properties, a confectionery, and the famous Dreamland Theater before it burned down. This is Wilhelmina Guess Howell. She's a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was also the niece of Dr. A.C. Jackson. Her dad was an attorney who went to Howard. Wilhelmina herself also went to Howard University, came back and worked as a teacher. She started to go on record and share her stories later in her life, I believe in her 80s. Like a lot of survivors, they began to share their experience of surviving the Tulsa Race Massacre much later in life. We'll get to that a little later. Actually, in a very short amount of time, because we're running out of time. All right, so the Red Summer of 1919, this is a very important part of this story because this is when there were no less than more than 24, actually, so-called race riots or massacres targeting Black communities happening throughout the country during this year. And the Red Summer specifically refers to like April and May of that year. And essentially, they were like smaller versions of the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which folks would really target, and most of the time, these were African-American communities that were actually thriving and doing well, perhaps not Black Wall Street, but were also doing well. And they were really targeted simply for trying to just exist and create opportunity for themselves. James Weldon Johnson, he was the head of the NAACP. He termed it the Red Summer because in some cases, the streets literally ran red with blood. Some of the worst massacres occurred in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Arkansas. We've got a picture here. This is the beginning of the Chicago race riot. A young Black man was in the water, a pool or something, and he crossed the line that divided whites and Blacks, and he was hit in the head with a rock. He drowned, and that began the Chicago race riot of 1919. This is the race riot in Washington, D.C. In 1919 as well. This is also a very famous picture. All right, so what happened? How did the Tulsa Race Massacre come to be? So we've set up the history of a very thriving Oklahoma, a very prosperous Greenwood, or Black Wall Street as we know it, but a lot of racism, a lot of segregation. Black people couldn't even shop in downtown Tulsa, really, so they had to create their own insular economy just to survive, ironically, and they were targeted because they were doing so well. But what was happening in the country at the time, many lynchings were actually recorded that year of 1919. Nearly 100 lynchings were recorded, and lynchings were becoming more and more common. Additionally, lynchings were also being carried out after a Black man might have been accused of assaulting a white woman. That's the excuse a lot of perpetrators of lynchings used when they did so, when they decided to attack perhaps or lynch a Black man and then attack a Black community. And that's essentially what happened in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so essentially, there was a Black man named Dick Rowland. He was 19 years old. He actually was a shoe shine man, and he was working downtown. He needed to use the bathroom. He went in a building that he had frequented often, the only building he was allowed really to use the bathroom in at the time because of segregation. There was a white elevator operator on that elevator as well. Her name was Sarah Page. The elevator lurched, and it caused Dick Rowland to really fall into Sarah. Store clerk, he reported it to the police as an attempted assault. Dick Rowland ran away because he knew being accused of assaulting a white woman would get him killed. He was eventually arrested. He was held in the jail in Tulsa. This was on March 30th. And by March 31st, a lynch mob had formed outside of that jail waiting to lynch him. And Dick Rowland was actually kept very securely in the jail. But some folks from Black Wall Street, some leaders there, in fact, a couple of contingents of Black men came to the jail where Dick Rowland was being held to make sure he did not get lynched. A lot of these were World War I veterans, so they were, experienced in combat. However, a scuffle broke out between a Black man and a white man from the lynch mob. A shot went off, and there began the Tulsa Race Massacre. And essentially, the lynch mob, they turned their attention away from Dick Rowland in the jail and just completely flooded the community of Greenwood. And here's another picture there. You can see they set houses on fires. They actually killed women, men, children, the elderly. Nobody was spared. What they would do is they would actually round up as many Black men as they could find and take them and hold them in a certain area. And it essentially left Greenwood defenseless against this mob. So they went in and they were able to loot the homes, take out, people were seen going in the homes with bags, take out whatever they wanted, and then they would set the homes on fire. About 300 or so people are estimated to have died in the massacre. 8,000 left homeless. And of course, this was a terrible day for Tulsa. And I'm just going to keep on skipping ahead here because we're running out of time. And believe it or not, there were efforts actually to kick Black people off of the land that they own, much of which had been reduced to rubble at the time anyway, after the massacre. But thanks to a Black attorney named B.C. Franklin and his team, they went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court and they defeated a law that would have allowed Black people to be kicked off of their land. And so Black people were able to stay on their land. That's the Dreamland Theater that I mentioned earlier. Nobody was actually prosecuted for the riot itself, for the massacre itself. No Black person actually received compensation, neither from their insurance company or from the city, for everything they lost. J.B. Stratford is an example of that. He was also one of the wealthiest men in Tulsa. He was charged for rioting, actually, and he skipped bail and fled to Chicago so that he could avoid being prosecuted. He was posthumously pardoned in 1996, 75 years after the massacre. And the most remarkable part about this, I think, is that Black Wall Street, those who stayed in Black Wall Street after the massacre, they were able to rebuild their community so that it was actually more prosperous than the first iteration of Black Wall Street. This happened between the 1920s and the 1950s. Black Wall Street experienced this sort of resurgence, economic resurgence, actually. And you're looking at right now, this is a woman. She was a journalist and a survivor of the massacre. Her name was Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish, and she actually went around and interviewed people about their experiences in the massacre. So much of what we know today is because of her. And that concludes my presentation.
Awesome stuff. Yeah. We've actually got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to dive right into them to make sure that we can answer as many as possible before we run out of time. So the top voted one is from Bill. And Bill asks, did Black settlers that took part in the land runs have any specific relationship to the Black population who came to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears? Were they aware of there's a little more. Were they aware of pre-existing Black communities, and was there cooperation or competition between the different streams of Black settlers before statehood?
Yeah, so I'm sure, and I believe this is documented. Boosters is what they were called. They were advertising Tulsa and particularly Greenwood as this promised land for Black people. There was actually efforts to make it an all Black town, but that never succeeded. However, folks were, asking their families or relatives, telling anybody they could, come on up, because this is a new start. There's opportunity here. Everybody who existed, all the Black people, whether they were from the South or whether they had already existed in Tulsa, they all lived in these all Black towns together, and made a cohesive sort of community together, including in Black Wall Street.
Our next question is from Rob. By the time of the race massacre, was there much continuing interaction between the African American and Native American communities?
So that's a very interesting question. I'm going to try to answer very quickly. Before the massacre, as I mentioned, a lot of Native Americans and African Americans, slavery was different between Native Americans and African Americans and white people and Black people, right? And so there was a lot of commingling. Some slaves and Native Americans married one another. The Seminole is really known for that. The Seminole tribe are known for that. And so there was interaction, but it was fractured after the U.S. government took the land away and allotted it individually to people. There were efforts to stop them from doing this, to giving it to Black people. So it really just depended on the tribe, and each tribe practiced slavery differently. And so each tribe had a different relationship with either their slaves or former slaves because of that, some more extreme than others.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. From Gregory Murray. How well is the history of this violence against the Black community being incorporated into history education now, locally or nationally?
Good question. My secret wish is that somehow this will be in every history book in every public school in America. However, at this point, just this year, I believe in February, the state of Oklahoma decided that they were going to make the Tulsa Race Massacre part of their history curriculum. Nearly 100 years later, next year will be the centennial. It took a long time, but finally that happened. The Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, which is who I partnered with to create this podcast, they worked with the state of Oklahoma to develop a curriculum for the state to implement this into their history lessons. Hopefully they'll be able to work with other states and educational organizations to get this in history books all across the country. But no, right now it's not in most history lessons.
From David Montgomery, what did you think about how HBO's show Watchmen depicted the Tulsa Race Massacre? If you've seen it.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah, of course. Oh, yeah, I totally saw it. And my husband's a huge comic fan, so we had to watch it. But I'm so glad you asked that question. I interviewed somebody on my podcast. Her name is Dr. Alicia Orawale. She's an anthropologist at the University of Tulsa. And what she helped me understand was that in Watchmen, the Tulsa Race Massacre was depicted in the daytime. So you saw people running for their lives, being shot. One thing I forgot to mention is bombs were actually dropped on the community of Greenwood. This would probably be the only time in American history where Americans dropped bombs on other Americans on American soil. And you see all this happening in the daytime in Watchmen. But she actually informed me that most of this massacre took place in the dark at night. And so imagine fleeing for your life, trying to find your family members, trying to get to safety in the dark. So it's a really terrifying, I think, thing to think about. But I think Watchmen did the best they could. And honestly, it was probably easier to show it in the daylight to see, the extent of the horrific nature of the massacre.
We've got a very slight delay, so if I'm interrupting you, I apologize.
Do we have any more questions?
Yes, we do. Okay, yeah, sorry. We may have a very long delay, so I'll just talk through it. Then
well, I don't hear Eric, so I'm going to. Are you there, Eric?
Yes, we have a delay. So
I think we lost Eric. Oh no! All right.
Really?
Do you know the current Black population of Tulsa percentage-wise? Has it stayed steady, or did they leave after the massacre? That's a good question. So, as I mentioned, Tulsa experienced a sort of resurgence, an economic resurgence between the 1920s. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Eric. Oh, that's okay. I just started to answer the next question because I didn't hear you. Okay. Well, I can hear you. So I'm gonna do you want me to continue answering the questions? Okay. Yeah, slight delay here. So I'm going to try to go through this until I hear Eric again. Do you know the current Black population of Tulsa? Has it stayed steady, or did they leave after the massacre? So as I mentioned, a lot of Black Tulsans stayed. They rebuilt after the massacre between the 1920s and the 1950s. Black Wall Street experienced an economic resurgence. However, once desegregation began to be implemented throughout the country, Black Tulsans began to spend their money elsewhere because they could. They really weren't allowed to, or they weren't able to do so freely before. And that sort of led to the economic decline of Black Wall Street. And so, no, it is nowhere near as prosperous. It's not prosperous at all. However, it is experiencing a bit of a renaissance, in part because of the attention being paid to it today. Okay, and I'm going to see if I can answer one more question here. Let's see, we've got a little bit of time. I can go up here. Is there a way? Somebody said, I took Oklahoma history in junior high 1 hour from Tulsa where we lived. We did not discuss this at all. I'm so glad this is finally being discussed. Okay, cool. I'm glad you are glad. That's awesome. To the massacre. And in Tulsa in general, there were about 90 to 100,000 people, are what the estimates show. And because of that disproportionate number between 100,000 and 10,000, that's kind of why Black Wall Street was decimated. The Black people who tried to defend it really were just outnumbered in the massacre, despite their efforts to keep people from burning it down. All right. Old pictures, and they really pictures in the public domain. So that is something you all are also able to find yourself there as well. All right. And one of the things that's happening now and I think we might have gone through the questions there. Okay, so from Eddie Chang, what were the trends or events in the 1910s that contributed to so many massacres during this time period, not just in Tulsa, but in Chicago and elsewhere? So that's a great question. The KKK was experiencing, the Ku Klux Klan rather, was experiencing a bit of a resurgence prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre in the years prior. They were actually almost defunct after the Civil War. The U.S. government sort of kind of shut them down. Then they experienced a resurgence. And so that was happening. You also had this element of vigilante justice that was very prominent, and especially in Oklahoma. So what I mean by that is folks were really just taking matters into their own hands to exact what they considered justice on offenders. And oftentimes law enforcement officials would deputize people who were not in an official law enforcement role. And sometimes they would do it, verbally. Sometimes they would give them like a gold star, and they would say, okay, you can go out and you can do justice, essentially. So this vigilante justice was really very prominent. And also you had a lot of Black World War I veterans who had recently returned home from the war, and a lot of Black men, I tried to allude to this earlier, but a lot of Black veterans, they fought, for their country. And they thought that in doing so, they would receive more respect when they got home, and they would be treated more like human beings and less like animals, essentially. And when they got home, that exact opposite happened. They were not treated very well. They were, in fact, treated probably in some cases worse, because these veterans had an air of respect and dignity to them that white people, or sometimes racists, because not all white people were bad, so let's make that clear, but they had an air of dignity and respect to them that racist people thought threatened their way of life, and would encourage Black people to try to climb out of their subservient station in life. And so these Black men, oftentimes in these sort of race riots or race massacres that happened across the country in the years leading up to the Tulsa Race Massacre, and especially in the first recorded times we know of that Black communities really started to defend themselves that way. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that World War I veterans were sick and tired of being treated that way and were experiencing. So I think Eric says, with a couple minutes left, how can we find you, your podcast, and learn more about your work? So that's pretty simple, podcast platforms, and just search for Black Wall Street 1921. You can also visit the website. It's at 1921.com. And there you will find our website. And it has a lot more information. It also has a gallery. So somebody mentioned these old pictures from the time. And of course, you can always email me or contact me through, put you in contact with other experts in this field as well. Obviously, a lot of people have been doing this work for many, many years. And somebody also said, thanks, Nia, for the podcast. I think it's one of the most important podcasts before, but I knew so little about something that is so important. I assume that person is talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And honestly, that's the point of my podcast, is to really provide an accessible way for people who want to learn about this history to do so. Not everybody's going to read books, like me or somebody else. Not everybody has the time to do that. But if you have the podcast, all you have to do is press play, and you can go down, take a trip down memory lane back in history. And I just want you to take away from this that Black Wall Street wasn't just the massacre. Black Wall Street literally rose from the ashes after the massacre, and the faith of the people that lived in Greenwood at the time. So I think my kitten is right by me, so I want to make sure she's okay. But I really enjoyed everybody's questions. Oh, remember, veteran led him to organize armed defense groups through the NAACP into civil rights movement was actually started by a veteran who was beaten, was blinded, and his picture was splashed across newspapers across the country. And that really led to awareness of the brutality a lot of Black people were experiencing in the country at the time. All right, so that's it. That's my time. Thank y'all so much for coming. Please find me online on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Just search for Black Wall Street 1921.
Awesome. And
thank you again.
I know we've had a bit of a delay. Nia, thank you so much for joining us and ending Intelligent Speech 2020.
And Eric, if you're there, I thank you as well. I know we had a bit of a delay here, but I also thank y'all so much for joining, and I hope to see you maybe next year. Maybe I'll have another podcast. Who knows?
All right, I'm gonna sign us off. So everyone can get to their closing arguments. Nia, thanks again. Thank you, audience. Great questions. Adios, everyone.